a press conference going on by the CEA on the GDP numbers. Let's directly cut into that.
Differences between real and nominal numbers, etc. I would request him to answer those questions. What we have here is that the provisional estimate is in line with what was told in the second advance estimate, that the real GDP growth for the year will be 6.5%. And that is a nominal GDP growth is slightly on the lower side. I'll come to that later. But the real GDP growth at 6.5% for the year is still, given the fact that many economies have seen their growth numbers slow after the initial recovery post-COVID, India still outshines many of the contemporary larger and key economies. Nominal GDP is around 9 if I'm not mistaken, it's around 9.8% for the full year. And the real GDP is 6.5%. So naturally, you're talking about a deflator number, which is close to 3.3%. And moving on, the sectoral compensation of the gross value added is services sector is close to 55%, and the secondary sector, which is both manufacturing, mining, utilities, etc., is about 27%, and the primary sector is around 18%. The important thing is the interesting chart on the right side, which my team has nicely put together, giving you a flavor of how this growth rate stacks up with the pre-COVID growth rates. If you look at agriculture, it was 3.6% on average in the pre-COVID 7-year period, compared to 4.6 in this financial year. Industry numbers are about 5.9% versus 5.1% for the period average. And services sector, 8% period average versus 7.2% this financial year. And if you look at the overall domestic demand perspective, as the headline suggests, we have a fairly robust domestic demand. Private consumption share of GDP has risen to the highest level of around 61.4% since all the way going back to FY 2004. So it's the highest in 2 decades. Gross fixed capital formation is nearly 30%. As a percentage of, these are, by the way, as a percentage share of GDP at current prices rather than in constant prices. That you can see on the left side. So, and then we have export of goods and services about 21.2%. Imports are shown as a negative number in the bottom below the zero line. So overall, we can see that private consumption is holding up very well, and capital formation is very steady at around 30%. And in the fourth quarter alone, real GDP growth picked up after the first 2 quarters because of election-related slowdown in expenditure, and both in the public sector and in the private sector. You can see that fourth quarter GDP numbers are at 7.4% year on year compared to the previous final quarter of FY24. And then again, on the right side, you see the comparison between India's growth rate in January to March quarter compared to other countries, and India has again performed better than contemporary economies. In terms of the growth drivers, in it is off-season, so to speak, whereas industry has picked up quite significantly after the first 2 quarters of slowdown. And monetary policy may also have played a part in terms of boosting liquidity and credit conditions. Growth has maintained its overall growth rate throughout the 4 quarters. And as we showed, in Q4 in particular, private final consumption expenditure did quite well, and so did, in fact, the big improvement was in the case of capital formation in the fourth quarter. These are also, once again, as a percentage of current prices rather than constant GDP. We also want to show you, in general, there is a perception that India's growth rate has slowed down after the first 3 years post-COVID, FY22, 24, and FY25, 6.5%. I think it's important to understand that globally it is a growth scarce environment. Some of you may recall that in the annual World Economic Outlook, semi-annual World Economic Outlook that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, brings out April, October. The April edition came out barely a month ago, and global growth numbers have been revised lower for current calendar year 2025 and 2026. Now, if you look at India's growth differential in real terms, what we show here is that real GDP growth of India, the blue colored bar, real GDP growth of what IMF calls about 30 odd advanced economies, and the difference is the green line that is charted. So now the interesting thing is India's growth in comparison to the average growth rate of advanced economies was on the lower side in the boom era between 2003 and 2010, despite one COVID year in which Indian economy did quite well, even compared, not the COVID year, the global financial crisis year. Even then, the Indian economy did much better than advanced economies. And in 2009, advanced economies suffered a contraction. India's 2009-10 growth rate was actually on the higher side. But the point is, the growth differential in this period, post-COVID, the black line shows you, is higher than the growth differential in the boom era period. In other words, India's performance in a relatively growth scarce environment, post-COVID, and in spite of the rising uncertainties due to geopolitical conflicts and trade tensions which predate 2025, I think India is actually holding up its growth numbers better than many advanced economies as well. I think that is something that we need to internalize quite a bit. That is why we put this chart together to show you that it is not the absolute growth numbers alone that matter, but how growth is holding up in an overall growth scarce environment is equally important. In the economy itself, as we now move into 25-26, how are things holding up? Because we are now 2 months into the new financial year. Actually, what is interesting to note is that both manufacturing and services, the purchasing managers indices on your top left, they are firmly in the expansionary zone. Then you look at the e-way bill generation, picked up year-on-year growth rate, actually improved to 23.4% compared to 20.2% in the previous month. And then on the bottom, you look at the average hotel occupancy rate in April was slightly better than March 2025. And then if you look at the port cargo activity, again, was much better than what it was in April 2024 and in April 2022. And growth in air cargo is 11.5% compared to 10% 1 year ago. So, or even for that matter, minus 4.5% in April 2023. So clearly, the momentum of the economy, which picked up in the fourth quarter, is continuing into the first quarter, and that's a good sign. Also, steady urban and rural demand. We covered many of this in the monthly economic review, but we just wanted to use this opportunity to share with all of you. If you look at the fast-moving consumer goods, in the fourth quarter in FY25, rural consumption was high single digits, urban consumption was slightly on the lower side, and domestic air passenger traffic in FY25 was consistently across all months above the previous 2 financial years. And vehicle sales overall, 3-wheelers, passenger vehicles, and 2-wheelers have been maintaining their steady upward momentum. We are giving you the year-on-year growth numbers for April 2025 in the small box tucked in between the 2 charts. And the tractor sales performance in FY25 was 9.4 lakh tractors sold, almost as high as 9.5 of FY23 and better than 8.7 of we all know very well that the headline inflation rate is converging towards the target, and the food inflation has eased. And it is a good news that the Met Department has predicted both spatially and temporally well-distributed monsoon in the course of the next few months, and that also augurs well. So I think the conditions are in place for a low inflation, steady growth environment supported by monetary policy and also the fiscal stability, which is resulting in a very, very record tightening of India's 10-year bond yield vis-a-vis the American 10-year Treasury note yield as well. And in terms of the external sector, core merchandise exports, what we call core is basically non-petroleum, non-gems and jewelry exports. Core merchandise exports was $344.3 billion compared to $320.2 for a growth rate of 7.5% compared to the growth rate of 0.1% in FY23 and 1.4% in FY24. So there was a pickup in the core merchandise goods export growth. And if you look at the performance in April 25, it is definitely doing much better than the previous two Aprils. In terms of services sector activity, the balance of services trade, the surplus of $189 billion, higher than 143.3, 162.8 surplus in the previous two financial years. These are FY24 is a provisional number. And the services trade per se in FY25-26, the first month of April, you can see that on the small box in the bottom.
All right, so Chief Economic Advisor V. Ananthan Nageswaran talking about the GDP numbers where private consumption remains resilient and India outpaces several major economies.